Hello, and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we're your hosts for the Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we seek to tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
We often take our energy for granted. As long as lights are on, the stove works, and the AC is running, we're happy. But how does the electricity grid actually work? And how does it deliver electricity that we rely on? That's what we will be diving into today.
The electrical grid is a large and complex system. A vast network of power plants, transmission lines, and distribution centers. It has been called the largest machine in the world. And utilities are dealing with many challenges relating to the energy transition as they look to increase renewables in the energy mix. Since renewable energy is intermittent, there can be a problem given that when we use the most energy isn't always when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing.
And who better than to have someone who works at an electric utility talk to us about these challenges? We are delighted to have Stephen Collins from Southern California Edison on the show today to explain to us what the duck curve is and why when we use energy matters.
We're then doing something a little different for our student segment where we go on the road around the USC campus. We ask people about their understanding of the duck curve and seek some practical tips on the ways to reduce energy use during peak demand hours.
But first, to set the stage, here's our conversation with Stephen Collins. So Stephen Collins is the Senior Manager for Strategic Planning at Southern California Edison, one of the largest electric utilities in the US that provides 15 million people with electricity in California. In this role, he works on defining California's energy transition to reach net zero economy-wide by 2045 and understanding what role the electric utility has in enabling that transition. He previously worked with the company on climate and sustainability risk, e-mobility, and engineering in the Advanced Technology Group. He has also worked for a startup company developing electric motors and generators. He holds a bachelor's in physics from Gordon College, a bachelor's in electrical engineering from USC, and a financing and deploying clean energy certificate from Yale University. Welcome to the show, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us on Energy Transition Talk.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Paulina. I'm excited to be here.
So to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you ended up at Southern California Edison and what drew you to the energy space?
Absolutely. My interest in clean energy started when I was 18. I took a gap year before I went to college and was trying to figure out what is a big challenge in the world that I could personally get excited about and see myself wanting to work on. And for me, that was 2008. It was the time when An Inconvenient Truth had come out a couple years earlier and climate change was front of mind. And a lot of people were calling the period Clean Tech 1.0. There was a lot of enthusiasm about investment in next generation clean energy technologies. So I got excited at that time about the idea that we could actually leapfrog some of the conventional energy technologies and go straight to deploying things like solar and wind to both address climate change, but also to address energy access. When I was volunteering, I got firsthand exposure to how important it is to have access to energy and especially electricity to have basic economic development to kind of move up the lifestyle rung from basic subsistence living. So that's where I got excited. I decided to pick the majors that I pursued, physics and electrical engineering, so that I could have the skill set to work in that space. And that's what brought me out to California. I went to USC in part because I wanted to come somewhere where I thought people were serious about clean energy, and California seemed like the place. So from there, I found my way into working with the utilities on a research project and ultimately into joining SCE as an engineer, doing advanced technology, looking at rooftop solar, looking at behind the meter batteries and electric vehicles and how those would impact the grid. And from there, my career has sort of just been me learning about all the things I don't know and trying to find out how I can get more experience and just be more impactful. So I've moved about a little bit. I tried my hand at a startup on electric motors and generators. I've worked across the e-mobility programs, which is more of a customer service role, thinking about how do we create the charging infrastructures that customers in Southern California need so that they can adopt electric vehicles. I worked from a corporate perspective on what risks do climate change and sustainability present to the company and how do we manage those proactively. And now I'm in the corporate strategy team and we're working on long-term clean energy strategy. This is the future of our company. It's the core of our vision for our role that we play. So it's really rewarding to me to be able to work on it directly.
Thank you for sharing a bit with us about how you got to where you are right now. And can we talk about the role of utilities in helping cities achieve net zero? Maybe thinking about how SCE is working to spur the electric industry towards a clean energy future, and what the role that utilities can play in the energy transition.
I'd love to talk more about that. In fact, we just wrote a paper on it. The paper is called Countdown to 2045. And it is our view on what it will be, what's going to be required in California to achieve net zero by 2045 across the entire state. And one thing that makes me really excited is the electric utility has a backbone role in enabling that transition. Some of the biggest pieces of our economy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions are the transportation sector, the built environment, and energy production. And if you think about what an electric utility today and into the future can do, by decarbonizing electricity production with renewable energy, you can create zero carbon electricity. Then you build out the grid so that that zero carbon electricity can be utilized for more and more parts of our economy. The transportation sector today is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But as we're seeing, electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. In fact, last quarter in California, I think 24% of new cars sold were electric vehicles. But it's not just electric vehicles and it's not just bringing down transportation emissions. The second biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state is from the built environment. Homes, businesses, factories. Fossil fuels historically are being combusted for everything from heating up the hot water to take a shower, to cooking on a stovetop, to running furnaces in the winter so we have comfortably warm spaces. All of that can and should be electrified. And in so doing, that's another huge area of greenhouse gas emissions that can be eliminated and powered with zero carbon electricity instead. So that gets me really excited. That gets our whole company really excited as we think about the role we have to play over the next 20 plus years in bridging from a fossil fuel intensive and emission intensive set of appliances and vehicles and power plants in our economy towards a whole set that run together without any greenhouse gas emissions. That's the vision that we have for helping the state achieve overall its decarbonization goals. Another thing that we're focused on is it's an essential piece of doing this the right way is having a just transition. So we serve 15 million customers just within the Southern California Edison service area. And those customers, they run a wide range of experiences, of income. They live in different climate zones. They have different socioeconomic backgrounds. They even have different air quality depending on their neighborhood and what it's close to. Maybe it's close to a freeway or one of the ports. And so when we are thinking about the right way to do this, what are the necessary protections and proactive steps that we need to be taking when it comes to all the things we can control, the rates, the programs, the incentives, where we build the power lines, where you build the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and doing that in a way that provides for a just transition and that allows everybody to have access to those benefits, not just the climate change benefits, but the air quality benefits as well. When you remove the electric vehicle, when you remove the combustion vehicles, you remove the combustion appliances, you get rid of a bunch of other air pollution as well.
Absolutely. And I know that one of the biggest concerns is around the grid's reliability. And we're talking about extreme weather events that are influencing climate change. We can think about the threat on a rolling basis about blackouts in years to come. So how are you addressing that, or how can you think about that, and the implications that this can have in the energy transition and in the future of Silicon Edison?
Yeah, those are great questions. We talk a lot about grid reliability and a related challenge, which is grid resiliency. So the nature of the electric system is it is a giant machine. It is always on, and it's been running at 60 hertz, vibrating back and forth 60 times per second for the last 125 years or longer. And we never turn it off. We never shut it down. We're just continually upgrading it. So part of achieving high reliability is the never ending quest to update and modernize and replace aging infrastructure. Some of the assets out there have been in operation for decades, and we need to find a cost effective and non disruptive way to modernize those. But we're also getting ready for the future. And there's a lot that we have available today that wasn't a part of the toolkit in the past that should help us achieve even greater reliability for all customers. Things like the declining cost of sensor-based technology. You can get a sensor in anything now. And the internet communication and connectivity, being able to get all these devices talking to one another, using AI to plan and to process, there's so much frontier opportunity to do things in more efficient, more effective ways going forward. But as you do that, it also creates more challenges. One of them would be cybersecurity. The related concern is resiliency. The biggest challenge that we see to resiliency is climate change directly. The impacts of extreme weather events that may be accelerated or made more severe by climate change on our electric system, on our employees who are working every single day, day and night to maintain that system, and on our customers directly. One of the things we've been focused on in the last few years is long-term climate adaptation strategies. We published a report last year called Adapting for Tomorrow. And that was based on some pioneering analysis our company did to look at what the possible climate change impacts might be in California in the years 2030, which we consider to be a near-term view, 2050, and 2070. We looked at variables including extreme heat, wildfire risk, sea level rise, flooding, and assessed how each of those, when accelerated by climate change, may impact our operations and our customers. And we are already asking proactively for investments that will help us be resilient to the risks that we expect.
Great. Well, the electrical grid is certainly a very large and complex system. It's been called the largest machine in the world, right? So we're just trying to break down one aspect of that today. In this conversation, we're talking about the duck curve and energy demand, which is a very important topic that affects energy consumers, especially here in California. So can you just explain for us what is the duck curve and what are we referring to when we talk about the duck curve?
The duck curve. So the duck curve is a very wonky concept that energy nerds like myself get excited about. Essentially, you have to see a plot of energy use throughout the course of a day to be able to visualize what people are describing as a duck. But I'll try to do it here on a podcast. Imagine you're looking at a chart, and on the x-axis, you have the hours of the day. You start at midnight at hour 0, and you work across from left to right until you've got to the end of the day. Historically, what happens is in the middle of the night, in the early hours of the morning, most people are asleep, most offices are closed, and most energy consumption is sort of low. Then in the morning, there's a little bit of a bump. You actually see energy consumption on the system go up as people wake up. They start to turn on the lights, they start to make coffee, they get into the office, first person there, all the lights come on, they fire up the computers. And historically, that would continue to rise. And the energy consumption goes up, especially in the summer, as it gets hotter and hotter outside. Air conditioners have to pick up their energy consumption to counteract the rising temperatures. And it sort of rises, it peaks in the afternoon. And then as people come home and it starts to cool off, that energy consumption goes back down. So you have some variation throughout the day in how much energy needs to be provided. but it never changes too quickly. It sort of picks up throughout the day and then settles back down in the evening. What we've been seeing in the last 10 years and what we expect to see even more of going forward is this phenomenon called the duck curve. To understand the duck curve, you first have to understand what's called a net electricity load profile. So net, you may think about net in terms of other contexts, like maybe in finance, you would think about net expenses, but net electricity demand would be how much electricity is needed minus how much electricity are customers already producing themselves. And the biggest way they do that is with rooftop solar. So if a home has rooftop solar, even though it may be using more electricity as it gets warmer outside, it's also producing a lot of its own electricity and likely meeting a lot of that need on site. Maybe it even has excess solar production that's going back to the grid and being utilized maybe by the neighbors. However, the electricity demand is still what it is. So when the sun eventually does set, you end up with the net load going from a very small amount. There's only a very small amount that isn't covered by the solar that then needs to be covered by everything else. And as the solar drops off, which happens pretty quickly once the sun gets too low on the horizon, the air conditioners are still running, the computers are still running, the lights are still on, and you end up with what's called sort of the back of the duck as you look at the neck kind of going up to the duck's head. It's very tall there. And that is the net load climbing, 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 because solar is no longer making up the difference. And you would need all the other generating resources in the system to be able to provide the electricity. Because the number one rule in running the grid is you always have to have enough resources available to meet the demand, to provide for the load that all the customers in the system are requiring.
Maybe just for context, what is the mix of energy sources that are being used in California? Maybe thinking out of our grid, how much is renewable, and maybe in particular thinking about solar.
Great question. The mix of resources changes all the time. A lot of what happens is there's variation in how strong the wind is blowing and what time it's blowing. Of course, we just talked about how there's variation in solar output, not only throughout the day as the sun rises and sets, but throughout the seasons as days get longer and shorter. And even within a day, as the weather changes, cloudy skies can reduce solar production. So you have a certain set of resources that make up what I call variable renewable energy. And those are solar and wind primarily in California. We have about a quarter of the nameplate generating capacity in California is from solar, and about half of that from wind. So solar is about twice as big as wind. That's in terms of how much they could maximally produce at any one time. But the wind can blow 24 hours a day. It doesn't always, but it could. Then you have a set of resources that can adjust as the operators request. So gas plants historically, but not so much in California anymore, coal plants, and then hydropower plants. You can choose how much water to let through the dam, and that'll affect how much electricity is generated. And a lot of times that's done to balance the variable production from renewable energy. And then finally, there's a category of generators that are typically running at about the same output at all times, and we call these baseload generating resources. So a huge one would be the Diablo Canyon nuclear facility on the Central Coast. That is pretty much up all the time and running at close to full capacity. So that provides electricity 24 hours a day. But there's other resources that have a similar operating profile. Geothermal is becoming a bigger part of the mix in California. And then finally, this is the newest piece of the puzzle, but as we have more and more variable renewable energy, we're also installing more and more energy storage. And that's by far the most flexible, because whenever you have excess production, let's say excess solar in the middle of the day, you can charge it into giant grid scale lithium ion batteries, almost the same technology you have in your car, or even your laptop, and you can save it for when you need it. For example, once the sun sets, but it's still hot, it's 6, it's 7, it's 8 p.m., the air conditioners are still running, that might be the perfect time to tap into energy storage and get some of that excess solar that was saved up from earlier in the day.
So does that mean that that reduces the need of importing energy from other places?
It could. It's helpful to be connected to other grids, other systems, other states, because even the weather systems can vary regionally. So a big portion of the clean energy that's used in California comes from hydroelectricity that's produced in the Pacific Northwest. And it's always going to be to everyone's benefit to have access to the broadest possible set of resources across the region, because the more options you have, the more likely it is you can find something that's cleaner and lower cost.
So that means that the duck curve doesn't only apply to California, is that correct?
Right. The duck curve will apply more and more so everywhere that solar is being adopted, which is happening around the world, because the driving characteristic of the duck curve is human behavior, what time we like to get up, the weather, what time it gets hot, and the characteristics of the sun, which we know it always rises and it always sets. And so there's going to be a duck curve emerging in all electric systems.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think a great overview of the duck curve. I'm really curious about how energy supply and demand works in real time. Could you give us a behind the scenes into what happens from the grid operator's perspective? Because like the grid is constantly balancing supply and demand, right? It has to be balanced every minute, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Totally.
And otherwise, if we don't match the amount of electricity consumed, there would be a blackout. So how do grid operators ensure that the grid is always balanced?
Yeah, grid operators have a very important job, and it's very much behind the scenes. And sometimes that's on purpose. There's a major security concern. We have to be very careful from a physical security and a cybersecurity perspective to make sure that grid operations are protected from any kind of interference, because we all depend on reliable electricity in so many ways. To go behind the scenes, there's several different rooms you might want to picture. The first would be the office of our analysts who look at rates and say, how much should we charge for electricity at different times of day? And that's designed to incent consumer behavior to move their consumption of electricity towards times when it's more available, when it's lower cost, and when hopefully it's cheaper. The next group of people that are really important to doing this well would be the energy procurement and the market operations teams. These are people who are thinking anywhere between a few years ahead. What kind of resources would we need? Maybe we'll need some more batteries for this system to keep it balanced based on the forecasts we have. To a week ahead, they're looking at the weather forecasts. A day ahead, they're looking at the availability of generators and what was the load like yesterday and what do we think it's going to be today. Even an hour ahead, what do we think we're going to need an hour from now? Because sometimes certain plants, they need to be called on before they're needed. There's a certain amount of time it takes them to warm up and get up to speed and be able to generate at full capacity. So you've got a market operations team that's thinking across all these domains. They're looking at prices, they're looking at forecasts, and they're trying to make the right calls to ensure all the resources that are going to be needed when the time comes, second by second, are there and are ready. Finally, you have the group that does real-time operations. I've been able to go visit it one time. It's the grid control center that we have. And it's very cool. It's a control room. So there is a giant video board. It's probably 100 feet wide and 20, 25 feet tall. And then there's little desks that are stationed in front of that board. And these operators are monitoring the real-time status of all the major generators, all the major electrical lines. And there's a giant like NBA style shot clock looking countdown thing in the middle that has the frequency of the grid. So most people probably don't think that much about what it means to have a 60 hertz electrical system. But what's happening is the electrons are oscillating back and forth 60 times per second. And if you have too much generation, then you actually increase the frequency and they start oscillating faster. And if you have not enough generation or too much load, then you start to drag it down and the frequency slows down. And once you've gone too far outside of the 60 hertz target, that can create problems all throughout the system. So they're making real-time decisions to try to keep that thing balanced as close to 60 hertz right on the nose as they can, because that's how everything is designed to operate. And they've got to make the increases and the decreases in generation to balance just the flexibility that it's kind of natural on the system in terms of demand. We can't control when people are going to plug in their car or unplug their electric vehicle. So you have to be ready to adapt real time.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about how much forecasting technology, manpower goes into making sure that our lights stay on and our air conditioners still work and
Mm-hmm.
everything else is functioning. And this kind of leads into my next question, trying to understand what challenges come with the duck curve. I mean, it sounds like it would be a good thing for a lot of solar to be used during the day. So is it problematic if utilities have to curtail solar because there's not enough demand during the day, other than, maybe we have some wasted energy? Or is the issue more that conventional power plants have to quickly ramp up electricity production to meet consumer demand in those early evening hours, and that might create risks that it'll be harder to balance the grid?
It's all of the above. There's challenges to ramping very quickly. You think about wanting to make sure you've got the right resources ready for when they're needed. But if that need is changing at 4 p.m., it's 10%. At 5 p.m., it's 30%. At 6 p.m., it's 70%. And at 9 p.m., it's 100%. Being ready to handle such dynamic swings can be a lot more challenging. This isn't my area of expertise, but intuitively that would make sense, that you've got to be prepared for much wider variations. And sometimes there's physical limits. We talked about how certain generating types, especially like a gas plant or even longer term, a coal plant, needs time to warm up. Batteries are better because batteries are available very quickly. But there's other stuff that you can't control. You're looking at the wind forecast. Sometimes wind does pick up in the evening as the sun's coming down. So it can naturally sort of help out and balance, but not always. And so that's one of the challenges that I would say the duck curve itself creates for operators. But generally speaking, as we think about getting to a completely decarbonized system, the challenge of solar is the sun only shines when it's going to shine. And so we're trying to design a system that can take as much benefit from that as possible. We talked about the role of batteries to store it and save it for later. But we're looking at what's the most cost-effective way to reach those decarbonization targets, and having some diversity of resources that are low or zero carbon. It helps balance throughout, not just throughout the day, but throughout the week and even throughout the seasons. Another solution that we talk about in the paper I mentioned early on, Countdown to 2045, is long duration energy storage. So this typically isn't the same technology that's used for the normal grid scale batteries. It's not the lithium ion technology, but it can be other forms of electrochemical batteries. Maybe there's some researchers at USC that are working on these right now. It's more of a frontier technology. There's also ways to store that energy in other forms. If anybody remembers from a basic physics class, you can have gravitational potential energy or other forms of mechanical energy storage. In any case, if you can store the energy and save it for a long time, the longest period might be seasonally, save energy from the summer when it's very sunny and use it in the winter when you might need it, or just save it and be able to use it over the course of several days. So we're looking at what would be the role of a battery that can discharge continuously for up to 50 hours before it needs to be recharged. That's a whole lot longer than what we typically see today, which are batteries that if you discharge them at full speed, will be empty within 4 or maybe 8 hours. Having 50, that gives you the flexibility to use it several times throughout the week before it's fully discharged and needs to be charged again.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that it does give us a better sense of solutions that there are to address duck curve issues. And maybe after thinking of solutions, can we maybe expand on the barriers to decarbonizing the grid and maybe having a larger percentage of renewable sources?
We wrote about barriers to decarbonization in the Countdown to 2045 paper. So I'll share what we categorize as the 4 big focus areas. The first is system planning. We've talked about all the complexity of the system, how many different pieces there are. They're all operating together in real time. But as we think about where it needs to go in the future, with the different companies, with the different state agencies, with the different scale from the generation to what's called transmission. These are high voltage, high capacity power lines that typically carry it longer distances, all the way down to distribution, which are lower voltage, lower capacity power lines that most of us have seen before, in neighborhoods. That's what goes the last few miles and gets it to homes and businesses. There are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of different planning processes, and we don't have a lot of time. 22 years, it sort of sounds like a long time, but given the scale of change that's required, we've got to be as efficient and aligned as possible. And so there's a lot of just process improvement that can be made and a lot better sharing of information. That will really, really help us achieve our decarbonization goals by getting on the same page and working from the same plan. Then the next big category we're focused on is what we were just talking about. How do you get the right mix of zero carbon generating resources into the state to be able to provide clean power at all times, all days, all seasons? And solar is a huge part of that. We see utility scale clean energy resources need to approximately triple from what we have today by 2045 to be able to provide all the energy that's going to be needed, not just for how it's used right now, but for all of the vehicles that will become electric vehicles, for all the heating that will be done with a heat pump, and so on. But we talked about the duck curve a lot. We got really technical there. There are other challenges when it comes to operating a reliable system, where the best solution is to have some of what we call clean, firm resources available. So that would be having more investment in nuclear, more investment in geothermal, or there could be other roles, for example, clean hydrogen, like a green hydrogen, that's energy that's stored in a fuel and can be called upon when it's needed. Those are the types of resources that they maybe will have to make up to about 15% of the total resources in the state by 2045. And they can provide a little bit of that balance that helps to ensure the overall system stays clean and stays reliable. And then maybe I'll just go very quickly into the grid part. When it comes to building the transmission lines, these are huge projects. They take 10 to 12 years on average to complete. But in order to connect all these renewables to especially the load centers, the major cities like Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area, we'll need to be building a lot more transmission lines to connect the resources to the loads. And at 10 to 12 years of project and 22 years to go for our deadline, we're probably going to have to find a way to speed those up considerably in order to get them all done on time. There's a lot of recommendations that we have for how the different agencies and the different processes can be streamlined and reformed. And then with the distribution grid, that final piece of the electric system that we operate on behalf of all the customers, as everyone's adopting electric vehicles and getting heat pumps and doing other things that tend to increase the amount of electricity that they'll need, we have to evolve that system and make sure it stays reliable and resilient to climate change, but that it can also increase the capacity of electricity that's delivered, even when the space available might be constrained. There might not be room in the neighborhood for another set of distribution lines. We might have to figure out how to get more power down the same street. So we've got a lot of innovation that we're focused on there in that space as well.
And does the price we pay for electricity depend on when we use it, at least here in California? I'm thinking that could be a potential incentive when thinking about solutions to encourage people to use electricity more during the off-peak times of the day.
Absolutely. So we're calling that time of use electricity rates, and they're becoming increasingly common. They're the default now in Southern California Edison service area, and they do exactly what you described, Justine. They have a different price depending on what time of day the electricity is used. So when electricity is widely available and it's low cost on the wholesale side, for example, in the middle of the night, that's when you have what's called an off-peak price. That's typically the lowest price that you can get in a time of use energy rate. Sometimes there's something called a super off-peak price, which is even cheaper. And there can be other incentives for if the energy is being used for things like an electric vehicle, where we want to incentivize that type of behavior. But in general, by creating off-peak and super off-peak prices, we try to create a financial incentive for folks to be able to save money by using electricity when it's most available. And the converse of that is we have on-peak pricing, which is when electricity is most expensive. And that is really when the steepest part of the duck curve is happening, because all of these generators are being dispatched, including natural gas, which has greenhouse gas emissions and it has a cost associated with calling on it when you need it. And so by charging the most for that electricity, consumers have a financial incentive to move some of their load. Maybe it's their laundry, running the drying machine or the washing machine or the dishwasher, some of these things that don't have to be done during the hours of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 at night. By moving those to another time, customers can actually save money and they can help the grid as well.
And that's naturally with everyone's electric bills, right? Like it's not a opt-in system, so you should be able to see on your electricity bill, like the different pricing categories.
I believe that it depends on each utility. So there's many utilities that serve electricity throughout the state. But I believe for Southern California Edison, it's now the default. We call them time of use, or TOU, electricity rates.
Yeah, so to circle back to the broader role of utilities in the energy transition, I'm wondering if you see the utility business model changing. I mean, currently you use the more traditional rate-based model where you pay based on how much electricity you use. I have heard of concerns that given the rise of renewable energy and distributed generation, more people using rooftop solar, electric vehicles, battery storage, essentially homes generating their own power, is putting the traditional grid on more stress. And from the utilities perspective, they may have this issue where they're losing customers while still having to repair and maintain the aging infrastructure, as you mentioned. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how serious these financial challenges are for utilities, and if you think there is a more dynamic and innovative business model out there that could be thinking about.
Yeah, it's a very timely question, a very important question. One of the things you were describing is, I think, sometimes misunderstood. There is no incentive for electric utilities in California to sell additional electricity. So if somebody adopts solar and they no longer need to buy electricity from the utility, that's not a problem necessarily for the utility, because the utility doesn't make more money by selling more electricity. This is very complex, but I'll try to simplify it. Essentially, what happens is the total cost needed to run and operate that grid reliably and to provide a rate of return or some profit for the investors who put in the money to be able to build and do all of that, that is calculated to sort of what's called a rate base, a total sum of money that needs to be collected. And that gets approved by the regulator in the state, the California Public Utilities Commission. That construct is put in place because utilities have a natural monopoly. They don't have to compete for the customers. So the regulator needs to ensure that that total amount of money that they're collecting is fair, that it's just, that it's reasonable. However, once that's been determined, that amount of money gets collected from the total amount of electricity sales, no matter how much or how little it is. And so if there is a changing amount of electricity sales, all it does is it changes the rate, because it's your fixed amount divided by however much you're selling. So that's a mechanism that's been put in place for over the last 20 years, since the energy crisis in California in the early 2000s. However, it's still very important to the utility to think through what are the best ways to use those rates. Just because we know how much money they're all going to add up to at the end of the day doesn't mean that there's not a lot of room for innovation in rate design. So we talked about time of use rates. Those have now become standard for us. Something that is in the news recently was net energy metering. This is how much somebody who has excess rooftop solar is compensated for the energy that they don't use and that they provide back to the grid. And that was an area where the utilities and many of the environmental nonprofits in the states, as well as other stakeholders, advocated for making changes because the reimbursements that were going to pay for folks who have rooftop solar, and statistically that tends to be people who have more means, they tend to be homeowners, they tend to be more affluent, it was compensating them too much. The value that was being paid to them for the rooftop solar was far more than the value that was being received from that extra energy. And that was creating a cost subsidy or a cost shift where the benefits were flowing to those subset of customers. And because all the costs still need to be recovered, it was being put as an additional burden onto other customers, including disadvantaged and low income customers, something to the tune of several $billion a year. So not insignificant. So that was a huge story in the news for much of last year. One thing that's coming next is some changes that the state is requiring to help especially low-income customers be able to better afford electricity as part of their overall monthly household expenses. So part of what's being proposed is a method to create two parts of your bill. One part is a fixed charge. So you think about how you would buy your cell phone plan. There'd be a fixed charge. Maybe every month you pay $20 or $40 just to have the plan. And then there would be variable charges based on how you use it. So it's not so common anymore, but I remember when I got my first cell phone, you got 200 text messages included in your fixed plan. And each text after that was 10 cents. Then they did it with data. And so when you think about electricity, we're moving towards, in the next few years, likely having a fixed charge, which can be adjusted based on household income. So income qualified households can have a slight a benefit by having a lower fixed charge. And then a variable charge, which is based on how much electricity each house uses. That variable charge, of course, goes down because the total amount of money collected doesn't change. If you're collecting new money from a fixed charge and the total amount you collect has already been predetermined, then the amount you collect from the variable charge goes down. And by reducing how much is collected from the variable charge, it actually creates an incentive for customers to use a little bit more because the price per unit has dropped. So the incremental cost to your household of getting an electric vehicle and charging it is actually less than it otherwise would have been. So it helps, we think, to create kind of clean energy incentives, as well as creating a little bit more of a just and equitable and more progressive way for costs to be recovered from customers considering their income.
Yeah, thank you for those very helpful clarifications. And that change may come as soon as next year, I believe. So could be coming really soon. So to summarize, why should we care about the duck curve, and what are some practical action steps that we can take to help smooth out the duck curve?
I think the big message here is that right now and for the next 20 years, there's going to be a mix of resources that can create electricity. Some of them are cleaner than others. And if customers are aware of that and are choosing to make adjustments to their lifestyle, especially when and how they use electricity to account for it, there's an opportunity for them to save money on their bill every month, but also to help support the grid and to help adjust their consumption to better align with periods when there's abundant renewable energy available. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, but increasingly that might look like the middle of the day when it's sunny out, because we are moving to such a high level of solar, both on rooftops and utility scale solar in the state. So these are opportunities that each of us, in making our day-to-day decisions, we can make little adjustments that when you aggregate it up to the millions and millions of little decisions that are made by each of us in the state, you can actually have a big difference on how the overall system is designed and how it's operated and how clean it is.
Thank you, Stephen. And maybe to start closing up and moving back to you, what inspires you or what motivates you about the future of the energy transition?
For me, I'm really passionate about this work, and I'm motivated by the opportunity we have to take a 100-year-old system and reinvent it. By the end of 2045, I think we will have an energy system in the state that supports a zero emission economy. And that is a template for the future. That's a template for other states. That's a template for other countries. And I'm proud to be in California, a state full of innovators. So I'm really jazzed about getting to work on the leading edge and to take things like climate change and environmental justice so seriously and be able to work through what are the challenges we expect to face and how can we address these in the most cost-effective, the most efficient ways possible.
Absolutely. And I know that many of our listeners might not be in California, so they will learn from this as well, from an outsider's view perspective.
That's the hope.
And maybe, is there anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with, thinking about energy demand, thinking about how they can learn more about this topic?
Sure. A couple of recommendations. I'll plug our paper again. Worked really hard on it this year, and I think it's very interesting. So if folks enjoyed hearing this discussion, they might enjoy reading Countdown to 2045. You can Google it, it'll come right up. Another thing is, if you really are trying to still picture what's that duck curve he was trying to describe, what's that look like, you might want to check out the app from the California Independent System Operator. This is called ISO Today. You can download it on your phone, and you can see real time how much energy is being produced, how much energy is being used, and what is the net demand. It shows you if it's renewable or what the source is. So I looked at it right before this podcast at noon on a Friday, and it was at 59% renewable energy for the real-time usage in the state. So some nerds might enjoy getting to have a real-time look at how these resources are being utilized every single day.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And the grid and market data are also available online. And we'll link to that definitely, and the papers you referenced in the show notes. So thank you so much, Stephen, for being on our show today.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Paulina. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, that was a really interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot. And it's a perfect backdrop for our next segment, where we go on the road and get people to talk to us about their energy usage.
We're going to see how much people know about this topic, and maybe we can gain some practical tips on how we can shift when we use our energy.
First, we ask people to introduce themselves.
Could you just share a bit of your names and maybe where you're from, where you grew up?
Yeah, I'm Natalie. I'm from Los Angeles, California.
I'm Leif. I currently live in Los Angeles, but I was raised in Vegas.
I'm Darcy.
I'm Brian.
My name is Sophia Harrison, and I was born and raised in San Jose, California.
I'm CJ, and I'm from San Francisco.
My name's Eric Webb, and I live in Swampscott, Massachusetts.
My name's Madeline. I'm from the Central Valley here in California, Bakersfield specifically.
My name is Jay. I originally from China, immigrated to United States 10 years ago. So I live California, Los Angeles.
We then posed the question to everyone. Did you know that you can save money and help the environment by using electricity during the middle of the day instead of the early evening hours? Here's what people said.
Well, our question for you today is, did you know that you can save money and help the environment by using electricity during the day instead of in the early evening hours?
No.
Ooh, I did not know that.
I feel like I heard that somewhere. It's like because more people are using it or something in the evening.
I did know this because it's less demand on the power grid.
I actually thought it was like overnight, that like if you run the dishwasher when you go to sleep, it's like better for the environment.
I actually did know that. My parents are really big into saving water. So I believe in California, we have a similar water saving program where if you run the washer and dryer after a certain hour, like let's say 9 p.m., you can save money on your water bill. So I knew something similar. I didn't know they had the program for electricity, but I knew they had it about water.
Yes, I think that a lot of the power utilities here too have like those peak programs where you have like a lower per watt rate or whatever during off hours, right?
Yeah, definitely. I usually quite often receive a lot of flyer from different company, Edison or the water company, and I usually do as much as I can.
So, as you can see, people had a wide range of answers. And then we asked people to share some practical tips on ways to reduce energy during peak demand hours, either based on their habits or the ways in which they already implement, or maybe other ways in which they consider implementing in their everyday lives. We got some great ideas.
So now that you know that, is there anything you might change in your daily routine to adapt to that and help our grid be cleaner?
I think using more natural light, because we have big windows in our apartment, but we tend to keep the windows closed and just turn on the lights. And mostly we study in the evening or work in the evening. So I think just like trying to use more natural light during the day and then only turning on the light when it gets dark would be a good change.
Day also.
I know it's better if I use like the low power mode on my computer and whatnot. I have a big desktop at home.
I guess I use I have like Alexa lights, so I just tell the devices to turn on during like certain hours.
I've been driving an electric vehicle for the past 6 months, upgraded from my Prius,
Awesome.
which is great. And I think now's a great time to switch to an EV. It's very easy, especially in Los Angeles. Has not made my life harder at all.
I was always raised to just make sure all the lights are off and unplug things when they're not in use. As far as using energy in the middle of the day, I try to use daylight and I don't turn on overhead lights during the day. I'm like the natural light a lot. And I try to unplug appliances when I'm not using them, like our water kettle or even our toaster. Oh yeah, and the laundry, yeah, I do the laundry when I'm at home after 9 p.m., or I believe also you can do it in the early morning, but I usually just do it in the night then.
I think the days that I am home in the afternoon, I could try to use up like resources during that time, and then when it gets to the evening, like around dinner time and past that, I could try to conserve my resources then. I guess I could also try like taking showers and cooking more in the first half of the day so that I'm not consuming energy when the demand is really high.
Are there any tips or things in your daily life that you do to try to maybe shift when you use energy to those more off-demand hours?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like laundry I try to do at those weirder times. And as a student, I think I have more flexibility in my schedule where it's kind of easier to do that. You know, I don't have that typical 9 to 5 where you come home and you try to do all those things in the evening. So on days where I have that availability, I try to be very kind of cognizant of that and do those sorts of things like run the dishwasher and make sure the dishwasher's nice and full, you know, really be smart about that kind of stuff. Like on really hot days, because I live more inland too, so it gets a little, you know, hot during the summer especially. I'll try to go to like communal places like coffee shops to do work or something, so I'm not running like the AC just for my house or something like that. But yeah, I think it's very about, you know, moderation and give and take and just trying to do your part.
Is there any tips or practical things you implement in your daily life to, you know, help shift when you use your energy?
And most time, some I use the hand wash, not a machine, so that will save a lot of water or electricity. So I, especially in Los Angeles summertime, only like very hot 2 months, I don't use air conditioning much. Actually, I like natural wind. It's pretty cool at night.
Yeah, definitely take advantage of that. Cooler air at night. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
We also talked to one person who had very valid concerns about the challenges of shifting when we use energy, and we tried giving him some suggestions.
With this information, is there anything you would change in your kind of daily routine to fit into these patterns that you can use maybe more solar-based or clean-based energy, or maybe during off-peak hours that are not from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m.?
I would be looking for recommendations to do so because generally I'm returning from an office in the city to my home during those hours. Also, my kids come home from daycare during those hours, and it's a high volume where we're using a lot of energy. We are washing our dishes, we are bathing our children, we are cooking, and those are the peak. and I'm open to suggestions as to what I can do. I'm only there during those hours. It's not like I can bathe my children earlier during the day. It's not like I can cook a meal in the middle of the day. But those are the obstacles, I think, and bottlenecks that we're all forced to deal with these days.
Are there certain appliances that maybe you could run during like overnight? Maybe like when you do your laundry or run the dishwasher? Is there anything, appliances that maybe you could shift to another part of the, or maybe on weekends? Because on the weekends, usually it's a little bit more balanced in terms of when everyone's using their energy.
That's a good recommendation. That's what I was looking to learn from you. So I know I'm the one getting interviewed, but I think that's a great call.
I think that after these conversations, it's been an interesting way of how people understand the way that they use energy and how it affects kind of the environment, their communities. I don't know, what do you think? What would be some changes that you would kind of take on based on their suggestions?
Yeah, I thought everyone was super open-minded and like open to learning something new and more informed on this issue than I thought, which is great. I think that one person who brought up the challenge of, they're at work all day and then they come home and they have family and that's when they do all their family activities. That's a very valid concern. So it is really about changing habits, day-to-day habits, and having this ingrained into how you think about the actions that you're taking on a day-to-day basis. So I might use that. I'm going to try to do things on the weekends or during the day, since I am a student right now. Maybe if I'm just at home all day, I can think about doing my laundry now on around Friday in the morning or in the early afternoon instead of in the evening. Yeah, what would you do and implement in your daily routine?
I think that likewise, and in a way, I started doing my laundry in those kind of hours that are kind of more solar powered. So I felt guilty about energy being kind of just thrown away because it was not being used. So maybe implementing those. I also like the coffee shop idea, so that you go to a place that more people are in that space that is being run by that the AC is running for more people, so supporting the community that way. And I don't know, maybe also an excuse to see other faces during the day. So
yeah, I think it feels counterintuitive, like when it's most hot outside, it feels like you don't want to be using any more energy, but that's actually, at least in California, it's the best time. We can take the most advantage of our solar resources. So yeah, definitely something to think about as we go about our daily lives.
I like that.
Well, that was a lot of fun, and these conversations have definitely made me more mindful of when I'm using energy, whether it's doing laundry, cooking, showering, charging my phone, or turning on the AC. When we use our energy really matters, and when aggregated, every person in our community can make a difference.
And tying in our conversation with Stephen, this episode makes clear that as the energy transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, utilities face new operating challenges because wind and solar are not always available. So keeping a supply and a demand in balance without a dependable baseload is a season-to-season thing, a day-to-day issue, and even an hour-to-hour challenge.
Battery storage will therefore be a game changer. If we can have renewable energy available during the times when we need it most. Investing in transition lines are also going to be crucial to bring power from where it is generated, say for Southern California, the desert, to where it is needed, i.e. the cities. Demand response or time-dependent pricing are also part of the solution. We can use electricity prices, in other words, economic incentives, to help balance out the grid. The story's not finished, yet all of these factors are dynamic.
Again, by this, we are reminded that the energy transition is up to us. It's up to the changes that we're willing to make as individuals and as a society. So until next time, we hope that you enjoyed learning a little more about the story of the energy transition, because the energy transition is up to you and me.
We would like to thank the USC Oshagi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a low-carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Special thanks to our many guests for today, and Avi, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to Energy Transition Talk. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we would appreciate it so much if you could leave a rating and review and subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina.
Signing off from Energy Transition Talk. See you at the next episode.